Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo, and I would like to take us through oil and gas in Uganda. Listen, the oil and gas basically fossils that are formed from the remains of ancient marine organisms such as algae and plankton, so which have been a subject of heat and even pressure over a million of years. Yeah, they are subjected to pressure and heat, and they are typically found deep underground in what they call geological formations. Now, listen, when you talk about oil, what other people want to call petroleum, petroleum is often referred to as crude oil, as a thick, dark liquid composed of hydrocarbons, and it is a primary source of energy and is used to produce a wide range of products, including gasoline, diesel, fuel, jet fuel, and other various chemicals. And if you are talking about natural gas is a mixture of hydrocarbon gases, primarily methane, and it's basically a clean burning fossil fuel, and is commonly used for heating and for electricity generation, as a fuel also for vehicles sometimes. Yeah. So both oil and gas play a crucial role in terms of the global economy as far as the industry is concerned, and they are very extremely vital for various aspects in terms of modern life, including transportation, heating, and electricity generation. So they are often extracted, as I said, from the ground using drilling techniques that are major contributors in terms of the global energy supply. So we're going to go through some of the science of these things, yeah, in terms of the formation of oil or petroleum for that purpose. So oil, or even petroleum, is formed from, as I said, from the remains of marine microorganisms, plants, and even animals that have actually lived millions of years ago, yeah. And the process of formation typically involves the following steps. Number one is what they call organic material accumulation, where dead marine organisms such as plankton and algae sink to the ocean floor and accumulate in sediments. And then there's what they call sediment compaction. So over time, these layers of sediment build upon the top of this organic material, subjecting it to increased pressure. Yeah. And number three is what they call heat and pressure. So as more sediments accumulate, these organic materials are buried deeper into the Earth's crust. So the combination of heat and pressure transforms the organic materials into what they call hydrocarbons. And then there's what they call maturation. So this process is also known as diagenesis, and what other people call it catagenesis. So it results in the formation of hydrocarbons, which make up the crude oil. Yeah. Now, in terms of chemical composition of crude oil is a complex of mixture of what they call hydrocarbons with varying molecular weight. And the chemical composition can actually vary depending on the pressure, but it primarily consists of the following components. It consists of what they call hydrocarbons. So these are compounds made of hydrogen and carbon atoms. And the main types of hydrocarbons include, of course, crude oil and things like alkanes, what they call saturated hydrocarbons, alkenes, what they call unsaturated hydrocarbons with double bonds, and then aromatics, what they call hydrocarbons with ring structures like benzene, and then they also components what they call sulfur compounds. So crude oil may actually contain sulfur compounds, which can lead to the formation of sulfur dioxide when the oil is actually burned. Reducing sulfur content is actually important in terms of environmental reasons. And then there's also what they call nitrogen compounds, and some crude oils contain nitrogen compounds, which can actually contribute to what they call nitrogen oxide emissions when the oil is actually combusted. Yeah. And also what they call trace elements. So crude oil can also contain trace amounts of metals and other impurities. That's as far as petroleum. Now, as far as the formation of natural gas is basically formed through a similar geological process, but for it involves the transformation of organic materials into primarily methane, what they call CH4 gas. Yeah. And the formation of natural gas includes the following steps. Number one, organic material accumulation, like oil. Organic materials from marine organisms accumulate in the sediments. And then number two, the heat and the pressure. Yeah, over time, the barrier of these sediments lead to the conversion of organic materials into methane and other hydrocarbon gases. Yeah. And there's what they call methanogenesis. Yeah, methane is the primary component of natural gas, and it's often formed by microorganisms called methogens. Yeah, which produce methane in anaerobic or what they call low oxygen conditions. So as far as the chemical composition of natural gas, the primary component of natural gas is actually methane, which is CH4, which can make up to 90% of its composition. So in addition to methane, natural gas may also actually contain small amounts of other hydrocarbons such as ethane, or what they call C2H6, or propane, C3H3, and butane, which is C4H10. It's a clear burning fuel compared to oil and coal, and produces fewer emissions when actually combusted. So the origin of oil and gas in the world can actually be traced back to the geological and even biological processes that have actually occurred over millions of years. And I'm going to give you a simplified explanation in terms of the origin of what we're talking about. If you're arguing in terms of the origin of oil and gas, biologically we can argue that oil and gas are actually fuels formed, as I said, from the remains of ancient marine organisms, such as plankton, algae, and even other microorganisms. So these organisms live in oceans and seas millions of years ago, and when they died, their organic matter sank, the seabed and mixed with the sediments. Yeah, and then the process continued in terms of sedimentary disposition, where over time the layers of the sediments, including mud, silt, and even sand, accumulated on top of the organic materials. So as more layers in terms of sediments built, the organic matter become buried deeper with Earth's crust. Yeah. And then, because of the heat and the pressure, the material of these organic rich sediments are subjected to what they call increasing heat and pressure within the earth. Yeah, and this process is known as diagenesis, as I told you, and catagenesis, caused chemical transformations in terms of the organic material. Why this is important? So that when we try to appreciate, we understand where we're coming from and where we're going as far as oil and gas. And then there's hydrocarbon formation under high temperatures. The pressure, the organic materials underwent what they call a series of chemical reactions that transformed into hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons are actually molecules made up of hydrogen and carbon atoms, which are primary constituents of oil and gas. And then another important process what they call migration and trapping. So once formed, the oil and gas can actually migrate through porous rock formations until they actually trapped by impermeable layers of rock, forming underground reservoirs, and these trapped hydrocarbons can actually be accessed through drilling. I hope you understand where we're now going. And then reservoir formation is another important aspect. The configuration of the rocks and the type of organic material and the geological conditions in particular regions determine the type and quality of oil and gas reservoirs. Yeah, talk about Albert and Graben area in the case of Uganda. So we also want to argue that the oil and gas industry has actually its own set of terminologies. So I'm going to give you some terminologies that are relevant in terms of understanding the concept of oil and gas, because I know it's a hot cake in countries like Uganda. But perhaps for starters, you need to understand what is the reservoir. A reservoir basically is a surface rock formation containing hydrocarbons in terms of crude and oil and even natural gas that can be economically extracted. Yeah. And if you're understanding another probably thing you need to comprehend is what they call crude oil. Crude oil is basically unrefined petroleum, which is a mixture of hydrocarbons found in the Earth's crust. And then the other, of course, is natural gas, which we try to explain, which is basically a gaseous fossil fuel, primarily consisting of methane, found in the underground reservoirs. Maybe aspects like the barrel of oil equivalent, what they call BOE. It's a unit of energy that represents the approximate energy content of 1 barrel of crude oil. And then perhaps words like drilling rig, you may comprehend them, which is a machine used to create boreholes in the earth to explore oil in terms of extracting the oil and gas. Yeah. And then another important word is perhaps what they call hydraulic fracturing, or what they call fracking. It's a method in terms of extracting natural gas and oil from deep underground formations by injecting high pressure fluids to fracture the rock. Yeah. And then another interesting one is what they call the refinery, which is basically a facility where crude oil, for example, is processed and converted into various petroleum products like gasoline, diesel, and even jet fuel. Another interesting one could be what they call the wellhead. The wellhead, basically this is a surface structure over an oil and gas well that contains, basically controls the flow of hydrocarbons. Yeah. And then a platform basically is a structure that is used for drilling and production of oil and even gas offshore. Yeah. Other words like pipeline, you probably heard about them, a system of pipes used to transport oil and gas over long distances, like the one that we are having here. And then what they call liquefied natural gas, what people call LNG. It's a natural gas that actually has been cooled and converted into liquid for easier transport and even storage. And then there's what they call natural gas liquids, what they call NGLs, yeah, which is basically the hydrocarbons found in natural gas that are in liquid form at a normal temperature and even pressures. Yeah, and then interesting words like seismic survey, which is basically a method of mapping, yeah, the geological of the subsurface rock formations using sound waves, yeah. That's another interesting one. And then production well, which is basically a well drilled to extract oil and gas from a reservoir. And then interesting words like downstream. This why I'm laboring to go through this, because when I begin to run through, you'll probably begin to comprehend why this become important. Downstream is basically a segment of industry that involves refining, distributing, and selling petroleum products. And then midstream, on the other hand, is a segment responsible for the transportation and the storage of crude oil and even natural gas. And then upstream basically is a segment that focuses on exploration and the production of oil and gas. As I said, I'm laboring to take you through these so that you comprehend the terminology. So when I begin to talk about some of these things, it easily makes sense, yeah? Then oil reserves, these are basically proven economically recoverable oil quantities in a reservoir. That becomes a little bit obvious. And then gas reserves, basically we would comprehend that as something that proven in terms of economically recoverable natural gas quantities, again in a reservoir, as I said. And then these are what they call the EOR, enhanced oil recovery. And these are basically techniques that are used to increase the amount of oil that can actually be extracted from a reservoir. You may also want to comprehend things like crude oil price index, yeah, as an indicator in terms of the price of crude oil, such as the West Texas, for example, intermediate, what other people call WTI, or even the Brent crude price. We will comprehend that when we come into that at a later stage. And then there's what we call commodity trading, where the buying and selling of oil and gas in a global financial market. And then there's what they call IPI gravity, which is a measure of the density of oil or crude oil for that purpose, used to classify and even characterize the oil types. Yeah, and that's super important because it also determines in a way what is the best. And then there's what they call the barrel, BBL. It's a unit of volume that equals to about 42 US gallons, often used to measure oil. Yeah, and then there's what they call barrels per day, which is BPD, which is a unit of production rate commonly used to quantify oil production. All these terminologies are extremely important. And this is what we call exploration and production, E&P, the activities involved in terms of finding and even extracting the oil and gas reserves. Yeah, I know many people are excited about oil and gas, so that's why I'm laboring to go through these. And then there's what we call oil field services, in terms of companies that actually provide services like drilling, well maintenance, and equipment well in terms of the supply of oil and gas industry. Another interesting one is what they call petroleum geology, which basically involves the study of the origin and occurrence and even the exploration of these hydrocarbon deposits. Yeah, and then there's probably another one that is what they call unconventional oil and gas, where resources like shale gas or even oil sands and coal bed methane that require special extraction methods. Yeah, and then we may also look at things like what they call well testing, which is basically the process of evaluating a well's performance to determine its productivity. So as I said, these terms basically encompass a wide range of concepts and processes within the oil and gas industry. And understanding them becomes crucial in terms of the working in and even the learning about basically oil and gas in terms of what is important. Other important words could be words like loyalty, yeah, because you're going to get to know some of these things, especially those of you who are doing oil and gas at master's or even undergraduate, even at PhD. So the share in terms of production is what they call royalty, typically paid to the owner of the minerals, right, the government or even the landowner. And then in terms of natural gas pipeline network, which is basically a system of interconnected pipelines for transporting natural gas from production areas to consumers. Yeah, and then there's what they call flaring, which is basically the controlled burning of natural gas and the wellheads or processing plants to eliminate waste gases. Yeah. You may also want to think about terminologies like reservoir engineering, where the branch of petroleum, for example, engineering that actually focuses on the modeling and the management of reservoirs to optimize hydrocarbon production. Brace yourselves, guys. We're going to go through quite a lot in terms of all the three processes. Yeah. So be careful to listen in and comprehend. There's what we call offshore drilling, where drilling, for example, drilling for oil and gas in bodies of water, typically in the ocean. Then there's what we call shale play, basically a geographical area rich in shale rock formation that is actually explored for its oil and gas potential. Another terminology that comes to mind is what they call enhanced gas recovery, which is EGR, which are basically techniques that are used to increase the amount of natural gas extracted from a reservoir. And then words like casting would involve a steel pipe installed in the well bore to support the well and even protect the groundwater. Yeah. And then words like wildcat well, which is basically a well drilled in an explored area to search for a new oil and gas deposit. Yeah. We may go through some processes how oil is extracted so that you can comprehend this. And petroleum refining perhaps is the process of converting the crude oil into refined petroleum products. And then organizations like OPEC, for example, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, where it's basically a group of oil producing countries that coordinate oil production policies. And then there are quite a number of institutes here in Uganda that engage in oil and gas. You may want to get some leverage to comprehend some of them because I don't want to do some kind of kalango for some of them. My emphasis in terms of oil and gas basically. And then blowout in terms of uncontrolled release of oil, for example, gas or even drilling fluids from the well, which often caused by well control in terms of failure as well. And then there's what they call flue gas desulfurization. Flue gas desulfurization, which is FGD. It's a technology used in refineries and power plants to remove sulfur dioxide from emissions. Yeah. Then we may have words like what they call pump junk, which is beam bump. Some people call it beam pump. Yeah, which is a mechanical device that is used to extract oil from a well. And then there's what we call also natural gas processing plant, which is a facility that actually removes impurities and separates natural gas into its component gases. Yeah. You may also want to look at things like crude oil distillation, which is the process of separating crude oil into different components by heating. And then, of course, hydrocarbon, as I just argued, basically organic compounds that are made up of hydrogen and even carbon atoms, the primary constituent of oil and gas, as I just argued in terms of the chemical components. Then exploration in terms of well, is what they call exploration well, which is a well drilled to determine if they are economically viable, quantities of oil and gas in a specific location. Yeah. Then words like naphtha, which is basically a light liquid hydrocarbon mixture produced during oil refining, often used as a feedstock in terms of petrochemicals. And then you may also want to look at terminologies like natural gas condensate. Yeah. Which is a mixture of liquid hydrocarbons often found in association with natural gas. Yeah. And then obviously you may want to comprehend words like petroleum engineer, which is a little bit professionals who design and oversee drilling and production in terms of oil and gas wells, in terms of what their mandate. And then perhaps wellhead pressure. Wellhead pressure basically is pressure at the mouth of an oil and gas well. Yeah. And then perhaps others like casing string, which is a series of connected steel castings that actually align with the well bore to prevent collapse and even protect the well. Other interesting things is what they call the HSE, which is health, safety, and environment. And basically the principles and practices are aimed at ensuring the health and safety of workers and even minimizing the environmental impact of oil and gas operations. We'll get there at a certain time. So as I said, the importance of this is that understanding these terminologies becomes super essential for anyone working in the oil and gas industry, or even anyone who wants to have an undertaking or an understanding, because they'll provide for you the foundation for effective communication, which I'm trying to do, and comprehension of the industry related to processes and even the concepts. Yeah. So as I said, my friends, welcome to the demystification of sorts of the concept of oil and gas in the world, but also with specific interest in Uganda. So let's argue this. The specific origin in terms of oil and gas deposits can actually vary depending on as I said, the geological history and even the conditions of a particular region. So as a result, different oil and gas fields around the world have actually distinct characteristics in terms of the chemical composition. Geologists and petroleum experts studies that these factors in terms of location, in terms of extraction, are valuable in terms of these energy resources. So it's important to note that the discovery and exploration of oil and gas can actually be attributed, as I said, to various historical developments in terms of locations, with significant advancements occurring over time. Yeah. So I'm going to give you a simplified overview in terms of their late discovery and in terms of their exploitation. Yeah. So that you may comprehend where, again, as an entry point in terms of the concept of oil and gas. In terms of ancient civilization, oil and gas sea pages were actually known to ancient civilization. For example, ancient Babylonia, for instance, used oil for various purposes, including medicinal and even construction application. So if you're going to argue in terms of early exploration and drilling, you may want to comprehend what they call the Drake's Well, which happened in 1859. Drake's Well, which was the first significant discovery of oil that occurred in Tazewell, Pennsylvania, in the USA, in 1859, where Edwin Drake successfully drilled the world's first commercial oil well known as Drake's Well. So this marked the birth of the modern oil industry as we know it today. In terms of development of the drilling technology, the drilling technique used in the early days were rudimentary compared to today's, of course, standard initially. So basically, initially it had what they call a cable tool, which drilling was actually employed, which involved repeatedly lifting and dropping a heavy bit, to break through the ground. So eventually, rotary drilling methods were actually developed, which allowed for a more efficient and deeper drilling process in that context. Now, in terms of exploitation and industry growth, we would argue and say that standard oil companies, for example, especially after the success of Drake's Well and the growing demand for oil, led to establishment of companies like the Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller. That was in 1870. So this company played a significant role in terms of the development of the oil industry. And you probably know the Rockefeller family in terms of the wealth, but we're seeing where they're coming from. So then we may want to argue in terms of pipeline development. Pipelines were actually constructed to transport the oil from the drilling sites to refineries and even the markets. And the construction of pipelines, like the first one built by the Pennsylvania Oil Company way back in 1862, facilitated the transportation of oil over long distances. Yeah. In terms of global expansion, we could argue in terms of what they call the Spindletop. Spindletop, which happened in 1901. In 1901, the Spindletop oil field in Texas, USA, experienced what they call massive gusher, which marked a turning point in terms of the oil and gas industry. So this discovery led to rapid expansion in terms of the U.S. oil industry, and as we know it today. Yeah, and then in terms of oil around the world, as the oil industry grew, significant oil discoveries actually have been made in other parts of the world, including the Middle East, Russia, and even elsewhere. Ultimately, even Uganda. So these regions have become major players in terms of the global oil market, as we shall see. Now, if you have to comprehend in terms of modern exploration and technology, we could look at what they call seismic exploration. Yeah, modern oil and gas exploration rely heavily on what they call advanced seismic surveys to identify these subsurface structures that actually may contain hydrocarbon reserves. Yeah, and that's extremely important. And then also there's what they call offshore drilling. So offshore drilling is, for example, where oil and gas reserves are actually extracted from beneath the seabed and has become a vital part in terms of the industry today as we know it. Then there is also what we call horizontal drilling and fracking. Yeah, in terms of technologies like horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing or fracking have revolutionized the extraction of oil and gas, from shale formations. Yeah. So it's important, my friends, to acknowledge that the discovery and the exploitation of oil and gas have actually significantly shaped the global economy and energy landscape. So these industries have actually evolved with advances in terms of technology, in terms of transportation, in terms of global demand, in terms of making oil and gas the two most crucial energy resources in the world. Yeah. So as I'll emphasize that the history of oil and gas becomes extremely fascinating journey in a sense that has profoundly shaped the modern world. So I'm going to give you certain key milestones in terms of the history of these fossil fuels. As I said, in terms of the milestones and what it brings on the table for the world. In terms of ancient knowledge, as I said, ancient civilizations such as the Babylonians and the Sumerians knew about oil and natural gas seepages and used them, as I said, for various purposes, including waterproofing, lighting, and even medicine. Yeah, and then if you look at it in terms of what they call the dawn of oil industry, perhaps In 1859, Edwin Drake, as I argued, drilled the first commercial oil well, and in terms of making the beginning of modern oil industry as we know it today. And then the Standard Oil dominance. If you look at the late 1800s, your guy John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company became a dominant force in terms of industry, controlling production and even transportation and even refining of oil and gas. And in about 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil due to what they call antitrust concerns, leading to the creation of several smaller oil companies. I think to break the monopoly. And then if you look at it in terms of the early exploration and discoveries, in 1901, what they call the Spindletop oil well in Texas experienced a massive gusher, leading to a significant oil boom and the growth of the U.S. Oil industry as we know it today. And then certain challenges happened during the World War I and World War II, where oil became a critical strategic resource during both world wars, leading to increased exploration and even production. Then also, if you have to look at it in terms of the Middle East component, especially during the 1930s, significant oil discoveries were actually made in the Middle East, including the giant Quahar field in Saudi Arabia, leading to the rise of major oil producing nations in the region. Even up to today, we all know what that has done for the country. If you argue that in terms of post-war periods, especially the period after World War II, it saw the global expansion in terms of oil and gas exploration and even production. And then we have entities that came into order, things like OPEC formation, for example, especially in 1960. The organization of the petroleum exporting countries, which is called OPEC, was founded to coordinate the policies of all major producing oil companies, affecting what they call global oil prices and actually supply. And then another interesting argument could be in terms of the oil embargoes. Especially between 1973 to 1974, where OPEC oil embargoes and then the 1979 Iranian liberation caused oil price shocks and energy crisis in terms of Western countries. At depth we can go into that. And then in terms of technological advancements, we could argue and say that these advancements in terms of drilling techniques such as offshore drilling and even deep sea exploration enabled access to new reserves. And then if you comprehend that in terms of what they call natural gas expansion, natural gas became a prominent energy source in the mid-20th century with the development of pipelines and liquefied natural gas, as they call LNG technology. And then you may also want to comprehend the shale revolution, which happened in the 20th century and the early 21st century, and the development of what they call hydraulic fracturing or fracking in terms of and the horizontal drilling unlocked vast reserves in terms of oil and gas in shale formations, transforming the energy landscape. So that became another super important aspect. In terms of global energy markets, the oil and gas industry has actually played a very, very crucial role in the global market in terms of impacting economies and even what they call geopolitics and environmental discussions. Perhaps another interesting one, which we'll argue, which I've already argued by the way, is in terms of renewable energy transition. Some of you need to look at our YouTube where we talked about renewable energy, and even our book on renewable energy. The 21st century, for example, there's been a growing focus in terms of a transition to renewable and sustainable energy sources due to environmental concerns and the finite nature of the fossil fuels. So it's important to comprehend that the history in terms of oil and gas is a story in terms of innovation, in terms of economic power, in terms of geopolitical influence, and also in terms of environmental challenges. So as the world seeks basically to address these aspects of climate change, basically the transition to cleaner energy sources and the role of oil and gas continues to evolve. So oil and gas have actually, have had a wide range of use in terms of modern society due to their energy content and chemical facility. So I'm going to give you some primary uses of oil and gas. By the way, everything I'm saying is in our book. Find it in terms of the law of oil and gas in Uganda by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. If you're arguing in terms of oil, basically petroleum, in terms of transportation as a fuel, the most well-known use of oil is basically used for vehicles, including gasoline for cars and diesel fuels for trucks and buses. We could also see it being used in terms of jet fuel. In terms of aviation fuels derived from oil and power, to power the airplanes that we enjoy left, right, and center sometimes. And then in terms of heating and electricity generation, oil is actually used in some regions for heating and electricity generation in power plants. So that's another aspect in terms of use of petroleum. And then also, it's also important in terms of what they call industrial feedstock. Petroleum is a key factor when it comes to feedstock for the petrochemical industry, used in production of plastic, for example, chemicals, and even synthetic materials. Then also, petroleum can actually be helpful in terms of lubricants. Various types of oil actually used as lubricants in machinery and even engines. Yeah. Petroleum is also essential in the sense of what they call asphalt, where oil-derived products are actually used to make asphalt for road construction. You see that happening here and there. If you're to argue in terms of the uses of natural gas is basically used in terms of heating. Natural gas is actually used for heating homes, offices, and even industrial facilities. And it's extremely important in European countries where it's winter. Yeah. In terms of also electricity generation, it's a clean burning fuel used in power plants to generate electricity, no doubt about that. In terms of industrial use, natural gas is a feedstock for the production of chemicals, sometimes fertilizers, and even other industrial products. Also, natural gas is important in terms of cooking. As I know, we use these even right here in Uganda. So many households and restaurants use natural gas for cooking. Yeah. And you know the different whatever cylinders, where you can get them and how much they cost. And it's also important in terms of transportation, in the sense that compressed natural gas, what they call CNG, and liquefied natural gas, what they call LNG, are actually used as an alternative in terms of fuel for some vehicles, by the way. That's another important aspect. And then combined heat and even power, what they call CHP. CHP systems simultaneously generate electricity and heat from natural gas in terms of the increasing energy efficiency. And then there's what they call cryogenic applications. It's also, in its liquid form, natural gas is actually used in what they call cryogenic applications, such as cooling and even freezing. Yeah. And then also, it could also be used in terms of what they call hydrogen production. So natural gas is a feedstock in terms of hydrogen production through processes like steam methane reforming. So it's important, my friends, to acknowledge that both oil and gas, as I said, have a crucial role in supplying energy for everyday use in terms of the industry, in terms of transportation. So they basically serve, as I said, as feedstock for a wide range of chemical products, making them essential resources for various sectors of the global economy. However, in terms of the environmental impact and finite nature of these resources, we can argue that they've led to increased interest in terms of transitioning to cleaner energy and even more sustainable energy resources, which you need to look at our book, as I said, the law of environmental sustainability in Uganda. And that's important for you because we have looked at some of those alternatives, viable alternatives. We have written a book, Oil and Gas in Uganda, which I'm majorly talking about. Let me tell you some companies that have engaged in drilling oil and gas. Perhaps one that popular is what they call ExxonMobil, yeah, which is one of the largest publicly traded oil and gas companies globally, which engages in exploration in terms of production, in terms of refining and marketing of petroleum products. You may also have heard of what they call the Royal Dutch Shell, which is a major integrated energy company which involves in various aspects in terms of oil and gas industry, including exploration, production, even refining, and even marketing. You may also have comprehended Chevron. All these are super heavy, big, companies. Chevron, an energy company which engages in upstream exploration in terms of production and downstream refining and marketing operations. There's also what they call BP, which is British Petroleum, which is a multinational oil and gas company with interests in exploration as well, in terms of production, in terms of refining, in terms of distribution of petroleum products. And then the popular one we have here in Uganda is Total Energies, which is a French multinational energy company with operations in terms of oil and gas in production and refining and even marketing. Then you may also have heard of what they call ConocoPhillips, which is an independent exploration and production company with operations in various countries as well. You may also have heard of what they call Equinor, which is a Norwegian energy company, which is primarily involved in the exploration and production of oil and gas as well. Then we may have heard of what they call Petrobras. Petrobras is the Brazil state-owned oil and gas company, which is helpful also in operating oil exploration and production and refining. Then you may have heard of what they call Eni, which is an Italian multinational company, again, with activities in terms of oil and gas sector, including exploration and in production and even refining. These are just examples of the different giants in terms of oil and gas, so that when you hear these things, they don't sound strange. There's what they call Occidental Petroleum, Oxy, which is an American multinational involved in terms of exploration and production in terms of oil and gas. So we have Shell again, and many others, as I say. So I mean, in Uganda, you can probably walk almost every corner. There's something that can identify yourself with some of these companies. In terms of the force, in terms of the force, in terms of the ability to supply or even equip our people, our country, with oil and gas, in terms of the advantages of the services that oil and gas provides for us. So oil and gas exploration, as I said, can provide various social and economic advantages to countries and regions, especially when managed responsibly. And as I said, some of the benefits in terms of good management of an efficient management of oil and gas would have huge economic benefits. It would have impact in terms of job creation. For example, oil and gas projects often create significant number of jobs, from skilled engineers to laborers, and this can reduce unemployment and stimulate local economies in terms of development, which we hope will happen for the sake of Uganda. It would be another booster in terms of what they call government revenue. Governments can actually generate substantive revenue through taxes and royalties, in terms of production sharing agreements, which can actually be reinvested in public services and infrastructure and even the social programs. Another aspect would be in terms of what they call economic diversification. So oil and gas revenues can actually be used to fund economic diversification efforts, reducing the dependency on single industry and even promoting growth in other sectors. We will argue that on a deeper level at a later stage. In terms of also infrastructure development, for example, investment in infrastructure, for example, including roads, ports, and energy facilities that also help support oil and gas industries as a benefit in terms of the broader economy. Another could be in terms of what they call trade balance. Oil and gas exports can actually improve a country's trade balance by generating income from international markets as well. I'm just trying to comprehend some of the advantages that these guys can have. In terms of social benefits as well, it can also improve our living standards in terms of increased government revenue that can fund perhaps education or even healthcare and social welfare programs, leading to improved living standards for the citizens. And then another advantage will be in terms of the access to energy. So oil and gas revenues can also provide what they call access to affordable and reliable energy sources, enhancing the quality of life and even enabling economic development. Oil and gas also, in terms of education and training, as an industry, basically the industry often invests in a workforce in terms of development and education. So it helps provide opportunities for local residents to gain skills and also employment, as I say. It can also be helpful in terms of what they call local business opportunities, where local businesses, for example, including suppliers and even service providers, can actually benefit from contracts and even partnership with oil and gas companies, supporting what they call small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, as we know them. In terms of also infrastructure for remote areas, in some cases, oil and gas projects can actually lead to the development of infrastructure in remote regions, which will definitely help in terms of improving connectivity and access to services. You could also look at it in terms of research and technology, where we're arguing that the industry invests in research and technology, which can actually have spillover effects in terms of support innovation and the development in these related sectors. So even as we argue the importance of black gold, as we call it, it's important to note that while oil and gas exploration can actually bring significant benefits, there are also potential drawbacks, including environmental impacts, resource depletion, and economic volatility due to the commodities price fluctuations, for example. So I will argue and say successful management and regulations become super crucial in terms of ensuring that the benefits actually, maximize while mitigating negative consequences. And many countries basically aim to use oil and gas revenues to diversify their economies and invest in what they call renewable energies in terms of sustainability to secure long-term social and economic stability. Look for that book, Renewable Sustainable Energy by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. But I would argue also that the legal and regulatory framework in terms of the oil and gas industry varies, as I said, from country to country. So it can be quite complex due to the global nature of the industry. However, there are certain common elements and some principles that are often found in such frameworks. And I'm going to give some major legal regulatory aspects in terms of, that are associated with oil and gas industry. We would like to talk about what they call concession and licensing. So governments typically grant what they call exploration and production rights to oil and gas companies through concessions or licenses, yeah? And so these documents outline the terms and conditions and the duration of these rights, yeah? And then you could also look at it in terms of what they call environmental regulations. These regulations are related to environmental protection and therefore become crucial in terms of governing areas such as drilling, spill responses, waste management, and even emission control. All these things, by the way, are in our book, The Law of Oil and Gas in Uganda by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. This book, this size, almost this size. And then the health and safety regulations, in terms of regulations that are essential to protect workers in the industry, and they cover aspects like equipment safety, well control, and even accident prevention, yeah? All these we have covered. And then another important aspect in terms of taxation. Governments often impose various taxes and royalties to oil and gas companies, including corporate income taxes, production royalties, and even value-added taxes. Again, I will super emphasize that all these are in the book, okay? You may want to look for it at lubogo.org or Suigeneris or at major bookstores in this country. Then contractual agreements. Companies may actually enter into various agreements with governments, including what they call production sharing agreements, service contracts, joint ventures to govern their relationship in terms of the revenue sharing. We have even put some of these PS agreements in as appendixes in terms of in our book. Then in terms of resource management, regulations may actually dictate on how resources are managed, including the rules in terms of resource conservation and even reservoir management. And then in terms of competition and monopoly regulations, some governments actually regulate industry to ensure what they call competition and even prevent monopolistic practices. And then in terms of pipeline and transportation regulations, we have quite written extensively on that as well, in terms of the regulations that would govern construction, in terms of operations, in terms of the safety of pipelines, in terms of transportation networks for oil and gas, as it were. And then the aspect of price controls. In some countries, governments may set even price controls on oil and gas products to protect the consumers or even stabilize the market. You remember the issue when the Ukraine-Russia issue, there was a rise in prices in Uganda in terms of oil. How we should have price controls. We have and then aspect of local content and employment. Some requirements require what they call companies to hire local users in terms of local supplies, in terms of development, and that is even here we have that provisions of the law, and we've written extensively in terms of that as well. And then community engagement and social responsibility. Companies will actually be required to engage in local communities, to invest in social and community development projects. Again, we have also argued that, and all these have been argued as independent chapters, by the way, in our book of oil and gas. And then international agreements in what they call cross-border oil and gas operations may actually be governed by what they call international treaties and even agreements. We have also argued heavily in terms of that. And then regulatory authorities, they are often, regulatory agencies, authorities that are responsible for enforcing these regulations and overseeing the industry. And then another one that's also important is what they call contract dispute resolution, yeah? In terms of the framework that may include mechanisms for resolving disputes between government companies, often through international arbitration. We've argued ADR as an element of, as a separate chapter in the field of oil and gas. So all these things, as I said, these legal and regulatory aspects are actually designed to balance the interests of government and the industry and the public in terms of ensuring responsible and sustainable development in terms of resource allocation. As I said, they may vary depending on country to country, and therefore the approach in terms of how a nation or how privatization or a combination of both is essential in terms of the companies that are operating in the industry to have a deep understanding of the specific legal and regulatory requirements in the regions where they do operate. So it's important also, my friends, to note that at the international level, there are several organizations and bodies that play roles in terms of regulating and overseeing aspects of oil and gas industry, and primarily focusing on global, energy markets and what they call maritime boundaries. So I'm going to give some key international legal and regulatory bodies and their purposes in terms of what they do. Yeah. I'll begin with the popular one, Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is OPEC. In terms of purpose, OPEC is an intergovernmental organization that coordinates the production and the pricing of petroleum products among its member countries, yeah? And it aims to stabilize oil markets and even ensure the core steady income for the member nations, yeah? Yeah, and then there's another one that we call International Energy Agency, the IEA. In terms of purpose, the IEA is an autonomous agency within the framework of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. So basically, it promotes energy scrutiny among the member countries and actually provides emergency responses, for oil and gas supply disruptions. Yeah, and then there's what they call International Maritime Organization, the IMO. In terms of purpose, the IMO is basically responsible for regulating shipping on a global scale, including the transportation of oil and gas by the sea. So it sets basically standards and regulations on, to enhance the safety and environmental performance of international shipping. Yeah, so that's another important aspect. And then there's what they call the United Nations Convention, on the sea, on the law of the sea, what they call UNCLOS. Yeah, the UNCLOS provides a comprehensive legal framework for governing the use of the world's oceans and their resources, including oil and gas. So it basically defines the maritime boundaries, the rights, and even the responsibilities of the nations as they they engage in these things. Yeah, there's also what they call the Energy Charter Treaty, which is basically abbreviated as ECT. Yeah, the ECT is an international agreement aimed at promoting energy security and cooperation among its member countries. It sets rules for investment protection and even trade in what they call energy resources, including oil and gas. Yeah. Then you may also want to look at what they call the International Gas Union. The IGU is basically a global organization that representing the natural gas industry, and it promotes the efficient and clean use of natural gas, fostering cooperation and knowledge and even sharing among industry stakeholders. You may also want to look at what they call the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, the IOPC. Its purpose basically is intended to it's an international fund that are designed to compensate for oil pollution damage caused by oil spills from tankers, yeah? And they are governed by international conventions and supported by contributions from oil importers and even oil tank owners. So that's another important aspect as well. You may also want to talk about what they call International Maritime Organization, the IMO. In terms of purpose, the IMO is a specialized agency of the United Nations responsible for regulating shipping. So it sets basically standards for safety in terms of security and environmental performance in terms of international shipping, including transport of oil and gas by the sea. Yeah. So it's important, my friends, to acknowledge and understand that these international organizations and treaties aim to promote cooperation and also grant safety and also environmental responsibility in terms of oil and gas industry on a global scale. So they address, as I said, issues related to transportation, resource management, energy security. So it's important to note that individual countries may also have what they call bilateral, even regional agreements and organization related to oil and gas regulations and even corporations. Yeah, so that is very, very important for us. I may give a little bit more organization and treaties in terms of what you may need to know. You may also want to understand what they call the International Finance Corporation, what they call the IFC. Now, the IFC is basically part of the World Bank Group, and it provides for financing and advisory services to promote private sector development, including investment in the oil and gas sector in terms of these emerging economies. You may also want to look at what they call the Energy Charter Secretariat. And now the Energy Charter Secretariat basically supports the implementation of the Energy Charter in terms of the Energy Charter Treaty, and basically promotes energy cooperation and investment security among its member countries. And then you may also want to look at what they call the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. The CBD basically addresses environmental and biodiversity concerns related to oil and gas activities, particularly in ecologically sensitive areas. And then obviously the good one, also the popular one, not the good one perhaps, but is the World Trade Organization, in terms of overseeing international trade rules and even agreements, including those affecting that, the trade of petroleum products and even petrochemicals. And then you also may want to talk about what they call the World Bank and Regional Development Banks. In terms of these financial institutions, they help provide funding and support for energy projects, including those in the oil and gas sector, especially in developing countries. And you may also want to talk about what they call United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Its purpose is basically in terms of addressing on climate change, and may influence policies related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas industry. Then we also talk about what they call the African Petroleum Producers Organization, the APPO, which is basically an intergovernmental organization for African oil producing countries, which aims at promoting cooperation and even cooperation within the African petroleum industry. You may also want to talk about what they call Arctic Council, in terms of the Arctic Council, which addresses environmental and geopolitical aspects in terms of oil and gas exploration in the Arctic regions, and coordinates policies for sustainable development. So I mean, I could go on and give different organizations, but I just want to create a wide background for you, so you understand that when we're talking about these things, you know where they're coming from, some of the regulations that are involved internationally, some of the advantages, the components, and then you can have a much better appreciation of the concept of oil and gas. Oil and gas, no doubt, has significant economic benefits, and the most important that the benefits include revenue generation, job creation, infrastructure development, and economic diversification. And I mean, just for Uganda, for example, you see how much impact it's bringing, including the coming up of an airport. So, but importantly, it's a very big source in terms of government revenue, generation. I'll give an example. Norway, for example, Norway's oil and gas, primarily through the government pension fund Global, often referred to as the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, has generated substantial revenues. This fund has actually helped finance the country's social welfare programs and infrastructure development. And then in terms of job creation, for example, I'm giving a comparative advantage or analysis in terms of other countries. Job creation, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, oil and gas sector has actually driven rapid economic growth in the UAE, creating jobs not only in the energy industry, but also in sectors like construction, tourism, and even finance. Then in terms of economic diversification, Qatar, for example, Qatar has actually used its revenues from liquefied natural gas, the LNG exports, to diversify its economy. So investment in sectors like finance, real estate, and even education have actually been possible due to the LNG income. And then in terms of infrastructure development, Saudi Arabia, as an example, oil revenues actually funded extensive infrastructure projects in Saudi Arabia, such as the transportation network, industrial cities, and even urban development. I mean, those of you who have been in these areas, you know what I'm talking about. Then you could also argue in terms of global trade and supply chain. I would give an example of Singapore, for example. So as a major hub for oil and gas trade, Singapore's economy benefits significantly from activity related to refining, to storage, and even shipping of petroleum products. Then in terms of economic development in some of these emerging economies, Kazakhstan, for example, oil production in Kazakhstan particularly in the Kagas, in what they call the Kagan, field, has actually contributed to economic growth in terms of infrastructure development, including the construction of what they call the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the CPC pipeline. Yeah. In terms of investment in education and research, I'll give an example of the U.S. In the U.S., oil and gas industry has actually provided financial support for education and research institutions promoting what they call scientific advancement and even workforce development. Yeah. In terms of income generation for developing nations, Angola, for example, if you argue in terms of Angola, oil exports have actually been a major source of income in terms of Angola, in terms of financing what they call critical infrastructure projects such as roads and even bridges and even hospitals. Yeah. And then if you have to look at it also in terms of what they call balancing trade deficits, India, for example, comes into play. India's oil refining industry plays a significant role in balancing its trade deficit by actually exporting refined petroleum products and even earning foreign exchange. Yeah. And then if you look at funding for what they call social services as another strong point, Nigeria, as an example, oil revenues, for example, have actually been a primary source in terms of government income, supporting spending on social services, even education, and even healthcare in Nigeria. Needless to point out that Nigeria is arguably probably the leading economy in Africa in terms of that. So these examples help us illustrate that oil and gas industry can actually provide substantive economic benefits, especially in countries which have these hydrocarbon resources. So it's important to note that the impact of oil and gas revenues, as I said, can vary depending on factors in terms of resource abundance, in terms of governance, yeah, and economic policies. So, and also environmental and social challenges that are associated with oil and gas exploration, yeah, which have to be managed in terms of creating what they call sustainable development. So we're going to argue also that the oil and gas industry is typically divided into three major segments, what they call the upstream, midstream, and downstream. So each segment basically focuses on different aspects in terms of the oil and gas supply chain. Yeah, I tried to define these words in the beginning, and that's why they're coming in. But for emphasis, upstream would engage what they call exploration and production. Yeah, so the upstream sector involves the exploration of for drilling and production of crude oil and even natural gas, and it encompasses activities from locating oil and gas revenues beneath the Earth's surface to bringing them to the surface. So the key operations include drilling wells, extraction of these hydrocarbons, and well maintenance. And in terms of the main activities, you basically engage in what they call exploration of oil and gas reserves in terms of drilling, exploratory, and even production wells, and extracting crude oil and natural gas. Yeah, that is something that is important. Now, if you're arguing or explaining what we talk about in terms of the midstream will involve what they call transportation and storage. So the midstream sector is responsible for transporting crude oil and natural gas from the upstream facilities to the downstream refineries and end user. Yeah, so it involves storing these hydrocarbons in various facilities, for example, like tanks or even pipelines and even terminals. So the major activities here is basically transporting raw oil and gas through pipelines, rail, and even ships, and providing storage infrastructure. That is something that you must understand. Now, in terms of downstream would involve things like refining and distribution. Yeah, so the downstream sector focuses on the processing of crude oil and natural gas into refined products such as gasoline or diesel or jet fuel and petrochemicals. So it involves the distribution of these products to consumers through retail outlets and even distribution networks. And the main activities here is basically refining crude oil and producing what they call refined products and even distributing them through retail outlets and even pipelines and other means. So it's important, my friends, that upstream, as I said, deals with finding basically and extracting oil and gas. Midstream focuses on transportation and storage, and downstream involves refining, distributing, and selling the final product. So these segments work together to deliver what they call energy resources to consumers and these industries, while ensuring a safe and efficient movement of these hydrocarbons from the source to the end user. That is very important for you to comprehend. Yeah. Now, when you're talking about oil and gas, basically as an industry, as I said, it's a vast and complex field with numerous major topics that are of interest to professionals, researchers, policymakers. But I will point out some key topics that are within the oil and gas industry, and try to comprehend some of them. In terms of exploration and production, we argue in terms of upstream, in terms of exploration techniques, in terms of technologies, reservoir, for example, characterization, and even modeling, drilling technologies, including what they call directional drilling and well control, and then aspects to do what they call enhanced oil recovery, or what they call EOR methods, and then offshore and deep water exploration and production. Yeah. And then another important aspect is, of course, the downstream, which is refining and processing, in terms of refining processes and technologies, in terms of what they call petrochemical production, in terms of refinery safety and even environmental considerations, in terms of product distribution and even transportation. And then another substantive area is obviously, which I'm arguing concurrently, is the natural gas and the LNG. Natural gas exploration and production, then liquefied natural gas production, and then transportation, and then regasification, and then shale gas extraction and fracking technology, and then natural gas markets, and then the trading. And then another important topic that you may want to comprehend when you're talking about this big subject is what they call environmental and regulatory aspects, in terms of environmental impact and sustainability. Yeah. And in terms of environmental regulations and compliance, in terms of climate change, greenhouse emissions, and then health and safety regulation in the industry. All these have been broken down in our book, Oil and Gas Law in Uganda, by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. Then there's also what we call energy transition in terms of renewables, where we're arguing in terms of transition to cleaner and renewable energy sources, renewable energy technologies, carbon capture and storage technologies, and then aspects to do with hydrogen production and even use. Yeah. And then you also, as a topic, you may also want to comprehend what they call geopolitical and global markets. Here you may want to comprehend things that have to do with global oil and gas markets in terms of pricing, geopolitical factors in terms of affecting what they call energy supply, OPEC and the energy security, and then aspects to do with energy policy and international cooperation. Yeah. Another important aspect that you may want to comprehend is what they call technology and innovation. Yeah. Under this, you may want to talk about things to do with advanced technologies in terms of exploration and production, the digitalization, for example, and data analytics in terms of the industry, robotics and automation in terms of drilling and production, AI and machine learning applications as well. That is a novel area that you need to comprehend and understand. And then the economics and then the investment in terms of the energy economics and the market dynamics in terms of investment and financing in the energy sector, risk management and hedging strategies, and then oil and gas taxation and fiscal policies as well becomes another important aspect. And then you may also want to comprehend in terms of what's called health, safety and environment, which is HSE, in terms of safety culture in the industry, environmental impact assessment, for example, occupational health and safety in terms of oil and gas operations, and then emergency responses and in terms of crisis management. All these, as I said, are in our book, The Law of Oil and Gas. We'll talk about everything. I'm just giving you hints to comprehend the entire subject. And then you may want to talk about social responsibility and sustainability in terms of corporate social responsibility, CSR in the industry, and then sustainable reporting and initiatives, social and community engagement, and then biodiversity and also conservation efforts. Yeah, another important aspect there. Then also you may want to talk about the legal and regulatory framework in terms of the oil and gas contracts, in terms of these agreements, and then international oil and gas law, perhaps in terms of what it engages, and then environmental regulations, permitting, resource management, and access rights. All these, as I said, when you look at the Law of Oil and Gas in Uganda by Isaac Christopher Lubogo, you will have a rendezvous. Now, these major topics, as I said, within the oil and gas industry are interconnected and they continually evolve. They reflect the industry's multifaceted nature in terms of addressing these economic, technological, and even environmental and societal challenges. So researchers and professionals and even policymakers need to focus on these topics as they drive innovation and ensure the sustainable and responsible energy development. Now, I may provide you with some other important aspects, but some of them I think you realize we've spoken heavily about them, and I don't want to again keep saying the same things like upstream exploration and production in terms of the exploration techniques, but perhaps what is important that the involvement would actually involve these systematic surveys, those of you who are going into the depth of it, and other technologies that are able to locate the potential oil and gas reserves in terms of seismic reflections, yeah, and then what they call reservoir characterization in terms of how engineers analyze these geological data to understand the characteristics of a reservoir, including its size and potential yield. An example is what they call core sampling and even well tests in terms of survey, or and then the drilling technologies in terms of modern drilling techniques such as directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing, and then enhanced extraction efficiency. In terms of, I'll give an example in terms of what they call horizontal drilling, which has revolutionized the shale production in terms of oil. And then enhanced oil recovery, for example, in terms of methods like steam injection or even chemical flooding. In terms of example, steam injection is basically used in heavy oil reservoirs. And then you may also want to comprehend what they call offshore and deep water exploration in terms of advancement in the offshore drilling, which have opened up access to deep water resources. An example is the Gulf of Mexico, where there's significant deep water oil in terms of production as well. And then refining and processing in terms of downstream, in terms of the depth refining process. Refineries convert this crude oil into various products, including gasoline, diesel, and petrochemicals. Example in terms of what they call the cracking processes, which break the heavy hydrocarbons into lighter products. And then the petrochemical production, where refineries produce these feedstocks into petrochemicals, yeah, and other products, like, for example, ethylene. And then the key petrochemical feedstock, and then you may want to comprehend refinery and safety and environmental considerations, where we're arguing in terms of safety protocols and environmental regulations that become crucial in terms of leak detection and repair programs to minimize emissions. And then the product distribution and transportation, where all products, for example, are transported via pipelines, ships, and even trucks. For example, the Trans-Atlantic pipeline trade, transport crude in terms of what they call the Prudhoe Bay to Valais. Those are components that you may want to understand. And then under natural gas and LNG, natural gas separation and production, techniques like, for example, as I said, hydraulic fracturing have actually boosted natural gas production. An example is the Marcellus Shale, which is a major natural gas player in the US. And then liquefied natural gas with LNG technology has enabled safe and efficient transportation of these natural gas. An example is Qatar as a leading exporter of LNG and shale gas extraction in terms of fracking, where fracking involves injecting fluids into shale formations to release gas. For example, the Barnett Shale in Texas was, the fracking pioneer. And then natural gas markets and trading, where natural gas becomes traded in global markets with price fluctuations. An example is the Henry Hub in Louisiana, which is a key component in terms of gas pricing point as well. Then you may also want to look at what they call environmental and regulatory aspects, yeah? In terms of environmental impacts and sustainability, the industry basically faces scrutiny in terms of its environmental footprint. Examples of oil spills like the Deepwater Horizon incident that raised a lot or a number of environmental concerns. So you have to look at environmental regulations in terms of compliance, in terms of the clean air, in terms of clean water, in terms of set emissions, in terms of pollution standards. Quite a number of regulations there that you need to comprehend. Then also in terms of climate change and greenhouse emissions, concerns about carbon emissions that have led to emissions in terms of reduction of efforts. You may want to comprehend the Paris Agreement that tends to limit global warming. Yeah. You may also want to look at the health and safety regulations in the industry in terms of ensuring worker safety in terms of drilling, production, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Act for the sake of Uganda, and then other regulations that may help you. So basically, those are simply examples in terms of substantive topics that would be relevant when you're looking about the oil and gas industry generally. But as I said, this is constantly evolving, and they are driven by technology and changes in global markets, and even in terms of shifts in environmental and even regulatory priorities, as I said. Now, other things that you may want to comprehend in terms of the general comprehension of the subject would be aspects to do with energy transition and renewables. In terms of a transition to cleaner energy resources, yeah. So as the world shifts towards clean energy, the oil and gas industry is basically diversifying itself into renewables like solar, wind, and geothermal energy. So when you're arguing renewable energy technologies in terms of solar panels, wind turbines, for example, or hydroelectric facilities. They are part of the growing renewable energy sector. So the argument here is also comprehension of carbon capture and storage, technologies that capture and store carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel plants, and then the hydrogen production and use, where hydrogen is actually gaining attention as a clean energy carrier with applications in fuel cells, for example, and in industry. And then you also want to comprehend geopolitical and even global markets as another aspect in terms of the general contextualization of oil and gas. Geopolitical factors like production decisions by OPEC, for example, and even global demand that affect the prices of oil. And then geopolitical factors affecting energy supply, conflicts, for example, sanctions and political stability in oil-producing regions that influence the energy markets as well. And then OPEC and energy security as well, OPEC's production decisions that impact on the global oil supply in terms of production. And then the oil policy in terms of international cooperation agreements like treaties like the Paris Agreement that influence energy policy and also the cooperation. Then don't forget to comprehend what they call technology and innovation in terms of advanced technologies in exploration and production. The advancement which include things like 3D seismic imaging and even advanced drilling techniques, and the digitalization and data analytics, as I told you. Big data and analytics actually used to optimize these operations and enhance decision making. And then the aspects of robotics and automation. Robots are actually used for purpose of inspection, maintenance, and even drilling in some of these cases. So the argument here is AI and machine learning applications. AI is basically used for predictive maintenance and even reservoir modeling and even optimizing drilling operations. So these are super important aspects when you talk about the concept of oil and gas industry. Then the economics in terms of investment, the energy economics in terms of the market dynamics. The economics of oil and gas is influenced by supply and demand. So the geopolitical factors and market dynamics in terms of investment, in terms of financing. The financing energy projects will involve a mix of public and private investment, for example. Then the aspect of risk management and hedging strategies. Companies use what they call risk management to mitigate the impact of price fluctuations. So that is another super important aspect. And then the aspect of oil and gas taxation and fiscal policies. Governments usually levy taxes and royalties on oil and gas production, as I said. So that becomes super important as well. We cannot underestimate health, safety, environment, as I told you, in terms of safe culture, in terms of the industry. Safety becomes a priority with cultures in terms of programs and training, aspects to do with environment impact assessment, projects which have to undergo that to ensure and mitigate the environmental impact. And then occupational health safety in terms of the worker safety, that is important in terms of the regulation and industry standards. And then emergency responses and crisis management, where companies have contingency plans for emergencies like oil spills and blowouts. All those are super important. It's quite an exhaustive discussion, so bear with me because I'm trying to talk about important aspects. Then social responsibility and sustainability, corporate social responsibility. Companies engage in CSRs activities, including community development and environmental initiatives. And then aspects in terms of sustainability reporting and initiative. Sustainability report in terms of document environmental and even social performance becomes a question of importance. Social and community engagement, where we are arguing in terms of relations between consultations with local communities, for example. And then aspects that have to do with biodiversity and conservation in terms of projects which consider biodiversity and conservation measures. I cannot super overemphasize legal and regulatory frameworks in terms of contracts and agreements, where we need to argue that contracts detail the terms of exploration, the terms of production, and even the distribution. And then international oil and gas law as well, which govern cross-border energy projects and disputes, for example. And then environmental regulations in terms of permitting. These regulations obviously will outline environmental compliance and even permitting procedures. And then aspects that have to do with resource management and even access rights in terms of government to manage resources and even grant access through leases and licenses. So even as we comprehend many of these things, the topics, as I said, represent a multifaceted nature of the oil and gas industry. So with each area having its complexities and challenges and opportunities, so the industry basically continues to evolve, responding to changes in technology, in terms of market, in terms of global priorities, in terms of sustainability, in terms of energy transition. Yeah, that is super important. And oil and gas, the book is this size, so you have to comprehend why we're going into the liberty of the pain of trying to comprehend all these things. Resource management and reserves as well. Resource assessment, which involves estimating the size and the recoverability of oil and gas revenues. As I said, we're employing techniques like 3D seismic imaging, and then reservoir simulations that are often used. Reservoir classification, for example, where reserves are actually classified into proven or probable and even possible categories, with each having different levels of certainty. And then reserve replacement, where companies strive to replace their reserves in terms of ensuring long-term production sustainability. And then the supply chain and logistics is another aspect that you want to comprehend when you talk about oil and gas. Yeah, supply chain management would involve where the industry would rely on complex, supply chains to procure equipment in terms of materials and services, and then logistics and transportations in terms of moving equipment, in terms of the products, in terms of personnel efficiency become extremely important. Examples would include pipeline logistics in terms of shipping and transportation of drilling rigs. Yeah, I think I talked about market pricing and volatility. Yeah, the aspect of oil price dynamics. The global oil prices can actually be highly volatile due to factors like supply disruptions and then geopolitical events and demand fluctuations. And then aspects to do with market analysis and forecasting. Analysts use various models and tools to forecast oil and gas prices, which influence the investment decisions as well. And then the argument of health and wellness in terms of the industry. In terms of the mental and physical health, the industry is actually increasingly focusing on the well-being of its workforce, yeah? In terms of assessing or addressing issues such as mental health and even what they call ergonomic safety, yeah? And then aspects to do with remote work and automation, in terms of advances in technology that have allowed for remote monitoring and even control operations, reducing the need of workers to actually be on site. Yeah, and then aspects to do with the innovations in energy storage, in terms of energy storage technologies, advancements in energy storage such as battery technology and compressed air, energy storage are essential for renewables and grid stability. Yeah, and if you look at that in terms of NGLs, including ethane, propane, and even butane, these are valuable byproducts in terms of natural gas production used for various applications, including petrochemicals and heating, as I said. Then you also may want to comprehend certain things that have to do with the regulatory challenges of offshore drilling. In terms of offshore drilling regulations, offshore drilling becomes a subject to stringent regulations, yeah? With a focus on environmental protection and even safety. And then you may also want to comprehend what they call Arctic offshore exploration, in terms of the drilling on Arctic that poses unique challenges due to extreme conditions and the need for environmental protection. And a super important aspect is decommissioning and abandonment. Yeah, at the end of the operations, oil and gas facilities, particularly offshore platforms, require what they call decommissioning at the end of their productive life. Yeah, so you need to comprehend that as well in terms of environmental remediation. Yeah, decommissioning involves environmental cleanup and ensuring that the safe abandonment of the infrastructure. And then aspects to do with the investment in renewable energy by oil companies. Yeah, it becomes a super important aspect in terms of diversification, in terms of renewables. So many oil and gas countries or companies for that purpose are actually investing in renewable energy projects to transition towards what they call a low carbon future. For example, Shell and BP have actually acquired renewable energy assets in terms of that composition. So my friends, these topics, as I said, reflect the ongoing evolution of oil and gas in terms of responding to the changes in technology, in terms of the energy markets, in terms of environmental priorities, in terms of the social needs. As I said, the industry continues to adapt and to remain relevant in terms of sustainable engagement in terms of the changing global landscape. Yeah, when we to comprehend again a little bit of a broader perspective, again, you may want to comprehend also things to do with hydraulic fracturing or fracking in itself as a topic in terms of fracking technology. So fracking, basically, hydraulic fracking is a method that is used to extract oil and gas from unconventional reservoirs like shale, yeah? And it involves injecting, as I said, high pressure fluids in rock formations to release hydrocarbons. And in terms of environmental and regulatory concerns, fracking has actually raised what they call environmental concerns, particularly related to groundwater contamination and even what they call systematic activity. So regulations and best practices would be required to aim to mitigate such risks. Then you may also want to comprehend what they call cybersecurity in the energy sector in terms of cyber threats. So the oil and gas industry is actually increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks, yeah? And therefore protecting critical infrastructure from cyber threats is a growing concern, and that is another aspect. So protecting, for example, digital assets, companies are actually investing in cybersecurity measures to safeguard operations, including pipelines, refineries, and even drilling rigs, yeah? And then the argument in terms of electric vehicles, what they call the EVs, yeah, and oil demand. The impact of EVs, the growth of these electric vehicles poses a challenge to the oil and gas industry, potential in terms of reducing the future of oil demand, yeah? So by adapting to changing markets, for example, oil companies are actually diversifying these interests and investing in alternative energy solutions such as EV charging infrastructure, yeah? And then comprehension of geothermal energy exploration and production becomes another aspect that you may want to comprehend. In terms of geothermal resources, geothermal energy is harnessed from the Earth's heat, so exploration and drilling are required to assess geothermal reservoirs. So you may want to argue that in terms of sustainable energy, geothermal energy is considered as a sustainable and renewable energy source with minimal greenhouse gas emissions. And then in terms of nationalization versus privatization of oil and gas, it becomes a very, very important aspect in terms of resources, especially in terms of what they call resource ownership. Different countries follow either nationalization, state ownership, or privatization, private company ownership in terms of oil and gas resources. In terms of economic and political consideration, the choice between these models has significant economic and political implications as well. So you need to comprehend the depth of that from our book as well. In terms of unconventional oil resources, where we talk about things like tar sands and oil shale, unconventional resources like tar sands and oil shales require specialized extraction methods and even face what they call environmental challenges. So resource recovery challenges in terms of extracting oil from these sources involves energy-intensive processes that can result in environmental impacts. And then you may also want to comprehend what they call smart oil fields and digital twins, yeah? Now, digital transformation basically under smart oil fields leverage what they call data analytics in terms of sensors, in terms of automation to optimize production and even minimize downtime, yeah? So digital twin technology create virtual replicas of oil field assets for real-time monitoring and what they call predictive maintenance. So that's another important aspect. Then if you have to talk about natural gas hydrates, yeah, what they call natural gas hydrate resources. Now, natural gas hydrates are considered as a potential future energy source, but these pose technical challenges in terms of extraction. If you're arguing it in terms of environmental considerations, methane, for example, hydrates have actually risen concerns regarding methane emissions and even climate impact. So you have to be careful when you're comprehending some of those aspects. And then renewable hydrogen production. Hydrogen as a clean energy carrier. We are arguing that the oil and gas industry is exploring renewable hydrogen production using methods like electrolysis. Yeah. So hydrogen in fuel cells, hydrogen can actually be used in fuel cells for electricity generation and even transportation. I was in Germany and I saw a hydrogen BMW, super nice car. Then there's what we call data privacy and regulation compliance in terms of personal data protection. Data privacy regulations affect oil and gas companies that actually collect and even process personal information. So if you're arguing that in terms of regulatory compliance, companies must adhere to data protection laws, especially with digitalization and even what they call data analytics. So my friends, even as you comprehend our book of the law on oil and gas in Uganda, understand that the topics that I've just talked about as I said, are continuous in terms of evolution, in terms of adaptation, and in terms of technological advancement, in terms of environmental concerns, in terms of changing energy market dynamics. As I said, it's navigating these complex challenges that we can have a quest for sustainable efficiency. So we may also want to comprehend other aspects in terms of what they call energy efficiency in terms of operations when you're arguing the bigger concept of the entire subject unit. Here we need to talk about operational efficiency in terms of oil and gas companies that are increasingly focused on optimizing their operations to reduce energy consumption and emissions, and energy management systems in terms of implementing the energy management that help to monitor and even reduce the energy use, as it were. And then you may also comprehend what they call methane emissions reduction. And now I'm really deep into the into the subject, but it helps you. So under methane mitigation, methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So efforts are generally important to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas operations, such as leak detection and even repair programs. So methane capture and utilization. Some companies capture and utilize methane emissions, as an energy source. And then in terms of oil field services and technology companies, companies that actually offer drilling, what they call service providers, and maintenance services are an integral part in terms of the oil and gas industry. And when you're looking at in terms of technological innovation, service providers develop cutting-edge technologies that enhance drilling and production efficiency. Then if you talk about digitalization, for example, of the oil and gas value chain, in terms of digital transformation, the industry is basically undergoing what they call a digital revolution, from exploration and drilling to supply chain management. So when you're arguing the Internet of Things and data analytics, the Internet of Things and data analytics are actually used to optimize operations in terms of and also predict equipment failures as well. So that's something, again, which is important for you to comprehend. And then if you're talking about oil and gas in terms of emerging markets, especially in terms of the energy demand growth. Now, emerging economies are experiencing rising energy demand, which presents opportunities and challenges, obviously, for the oil and gas sector. So infrastructure development, for example, developing nations are investing in energy infrastructure to meet these energy needs. And that's something that, again, is also important to comprehend. Then you may also want to comprehend what we call energy storage for grid stability, in terms of what they call grid integration. Now, energy storage systems like batteries are used to stabilize the electricity grid and facilitate the integration of renewable energy sources. So the aspect of grid resiliency in terms of storage, the enhanced grid reliability by providing backup power during the surges. And then energy policy in terms of climate goals, in terms of energy transition policies. Many governments are implementing policies and incentives to actually accelerate the transition to clean energy resources. I'll give an example of the Paris Agreement commitment in terms of countries who are aligning their energy policies with climate targets set in the Paris Agreement. And then another aspect in terms of which I know I mentioned a little bit, but for purpose of emphasis, what they call local content requirement in terms of economic development. Countries would impose local content requirement on oil and gas projects to promote economic development and job creation. And it becomes a challenge for companies in terms of compliance within these requirements, so that they can pose, what they call engage, or even I don't want to say provoke, but perhaps help these multinational companies to engage in terms of that perspective. And then if you're arguing renewable energy integration into oil and gas operations, where we're talking about what we call the hybrid systems, some oil and gas operations incorporate renewable energy sources like solar and wind to reduce their carbon footprint. So hydrogen production, for example, renewable energy is actually used to produce what they call hydrogen for industrial processes. And then an aspect in terms of what they call human capital and workforce development, another super important aspect in terms of skills and training. A skilled workforce is actually crucial for the industry in terms of companies to invest in training and also development products. In terms of knowledge transfer, so the industry basically is facing a knowledgeable transfer in terms of knowledge as a challenge as experienced by professionals who actually retire. So those additional highlights in terms of a response to global energy trends as I said, such as sustainability, digitalization, and the changing nature of the workforce is super important to comprehend these dynamics. Yeah. You may also want to look at what they call the green hydrogen, what the energy transition, and then the green hydrogen, specifically as an emphasis, because I know it's a super important area. In terms of the green hydrogen production, the industry basically is exploring the production of what they call green hydrogen using renewable energy, particularly electrolysis. In terms of application, green hydrogen has actually potential uses in terms of sectors such as transportation, industry, and energy storage, as I said. And then you don't want to forget things to do with emission reduction targets, yeah, what they call net zero commitments. Many oil and gas companies are actually setting what they call net zero emission targets in terms of aiming to reduce or even offset their carbon emissions. And then in terms of carbon offsetting, companies actually invest in projects such as reforestation, or perhaps to reduce on the emissions of CO2 to comprehend or fight the challenge. And then decentralized energy systems, in terms of the industry adapting to more decentralized energy systems where smaller localized power generations actually used to play a role. I saw that in Europe, and I think something we need to do. And then distributed generation, in terms of distributed generation, including solar panels and even microgrids, it becomes part of the trend. And then you may also think about things to do with what they call upscaling and circular economy. So upscaling or upcycling pronunciation in terms of waste products, the industry is actually exploring ways to upcycle some of these waste materials, turning them into valuable products. And then if you're arguing in terms of circular economy principles, reducing waste and promoting recycling is actually becoming more of an integral part of the process, as it were. And then geoengineering in terms of climate mitigation, where you argue in terms of what they call carbon removal technology, in terms of geoengineering solutions such as carbon capture and removal technologies that are under development. Then you comprehend things like solar, radiation management, which are controversial methods like solar radiation management aim to cool the planet by reflecting sunlight back into the space. Yeah, and then aspects in terms of economic diversification, in terms of oil-dependent regions, transition economies, as I said, becomes super important. Regions heavily that are dependent on oil revenues are seeking economic diversification in terms of strategies to reduce their vulnerability in terms of oil price fluctuations. And then investment in what they call non-oil sectors, investment in the industries like tourism, for example, technology, agriculture, become part of that bigger concept of diversification efforts. Yeah, I know I talked about responsive corporate governance. No, I think I had it, but that's another one. And in terms of environmental, social, and even governance principles, so companies are actually increasingly required to commit to these standards, which include responsible governance in terms of environmental stewardship and also social impact. And in terms of transparency, in terms of reporting, is also becoming very vital and essential for as an aspect of attracting investment. And then social licensing to operate becomes another important aspect in terms of community relations. Building and maintaining a social license to operate is essential for oil and gas companies, involving community engagement and addressing local concerns in terms of contribution to local development. Then you may also want to comprehend aspects to do with water management in terms of the oil and gas operations. Under water use and treatment, for example, water management is significant in terms of a concern that has to do with drilling and also fracking operations involving water sourcing and also usage and even treatment. Yeah, so recycling and reuse, some companies actually implement water recycling and reuse practices to reduce on these environmental impacts. Yeah, and then another aspect that you may want to comprehend is oil and gas in space exploration. Yeah, in terms of space resources, the potential for space exploration and what they call extraterrestrial resource extraction, including water on the moon and Mars, is actually being explored, and that is something you need to look at as well. And so in terms of space-based energy, space-based solar power and energy resources are actually considered for what they call long-duration space emissions. So as I said, these topics reflect on the dynamic and evolving nature of the oil and gas industry, and that's what I'm really dying or to explain to you that it's not just traditional oil and gas. And some of you who are teaching oil and gas, I think it's time to revamp or perhaps change or maybe update, perhaps is a better word, your syllabuses in terms of oil and gas to comprehend, as I said, many of these emerging or continued adaptation of oil and gas industry. You may want to also emphasize environmental social governance, what they call ESG, in terms of funds, in terms of investors that are increasingly considering ESG criteria when making investment decisions, in terms of favoring companies with stronger ESG practices, and then also ESG reporting, where companies are actually enhancing their ESG reporting and disclosures to attract responsible investment. We talked about renewable natural gas, the RNG, but in the context of production of RNG, it's produced from organic waste such as agriculture and even landfill methane that can actually be used as a clean energy resource. And then the aspect of biogas to RNG upgrading, where technologies convert biogas to RNG sustainable for injection into natural gas pipelines, for example. And then aspects to do with mergers and acquisitions in oil and gas sector, for example, in terms of industry consolidation, for example, the sector in terms of experiences, in terms of mergers and acquisitions, as companies seek to optimize operations and even assets, So the aspect of diversification strategies become a very major component in terms of oil and gas companies that may acquire renewable energy companies as part of their diversification efforts. And you cannot forget licensing and permitting challenges as well, because that's another aspect that's become super important as regulatory hurdles. Obtaining licenses and permits for exploration and in production can actually be complex and time-consuming processes due to environmental and even safety concerns. In terms of stakeholder engagement, for example, effective stakeholder engagement become crucial in securing approvals for oil and gas projects. Then in terms of electrification, what they call electrification of operations, in terms of electrifying facilities, companies are actually increasingly looking to electrify offshore platforms and even remote sites to reduce reliance on diesel generators. And these reduced emissions in terms of electrification can actually lead to lower greenhouse emissions and even operational costs. And then aspects to do with sustainable financing, for example, we would argue and say that greenhouse and sustainable bonds, for example, financing mechanisms like greenhouse bonds and even sustainable loans are actually used to fund environmentally friendly projects. And then aspects to do with climate risk assessment, for example, lenders are actually assessing climate-related risks in their financing decisions. And then you may also want to comprehend aspects to do with what they call energy storage and grid integration challenges. In terms of grid integration, you integrating energy storage solutions like batteries, as I said, into electricity grid is a technical and even regulatory challenge, but that is something that needs to be comprehended and appreciated. So the aspect of grid reliability, energy storage is crucial for grid reliability, especially in regions with intermittent renewable energy sources. And then the aspect of resource nationalism. It becomes a question of importance as well. Resource ownership debate is a substantial part of this puzzle as well. So some countries are asserting more control over their natural resources, leading to debate about resource nationalism. In terms of impact on investment, resource nationalism can actually affect foreign investment and even access to reserves as well. And then geothermal heat for direct use, for example. When you're arguing in terms of direct geothermal applications, in terms of geothermal heat, it's actually used for direct applications like district heating or even greenhouse heating and even industrial processes in terms of sustainable heating solutions. So geothermal is a sustainable, reliable source of heat energy. And then you may also want to comprehend things like advanced material and coatings, in terms of corrosion prevention, where advanced materials and coatings are actually used to prevent corrosion in pipelines and even equipment. So you may want to appreciate in terms of enhanced equipment durability. So these materials extend, obviously, the lifespan of the infrastructure. As I said, we need to rethink the entire aspect of oil and gas look at it in a much broader perspective, and our book provides that. When you're teaching, those of you who are teaching oil and gas, you need to look at it in a much bigger perspective. Look at our book, Oil and Gas in Uganda. Look at sustainable environmental renewable energy, and we read quite a number of books. Look at the book on climate change. Look at our book in terms of in terms of waste management. We've written quite a number of substantive books, and then so those will help you have a comprehensive overview. Local content. I talked about local content as a workforce in terms of development, where local workforce hiring. Oil and gas projects have requirements for hiring and training local workers to boost the economy. Skill development, for example, training and even development of programs that are essential for creating capable local workers. Yeah, and then the aspect of renewable energy integration in terms of oil and gas operations. Yeah, the hybrid system that's super important, and that tells you where we are going. Even as a country that has just found or struck oil for that purpose, we have to prepare ourselves in terms of that trend, in terms of hybrid systems, in terms of hydrogen production, yeah, in terms of renewable energy as used to produce hydrogen for industrial purposes such as refining, yeah, and then the biofuels, and then the bioenergy, you know, the aspect of biofuel production, for example. As an industry, we have to, Ugandan industry, we have to explore biofuels that are made from organic materials like algae, like wood, like agricultural waste, and then bioenergy production in terms of biomass energy, in terms of generation that is used in some oil and gas operations, and then aspects to do with offshore and wind energy projects, for example, wind farms. It becomes another super important. I know we talked about this in even on YouTube. I remember I talked about this in sustainable renewable energy. I think we have an exhaustive discussion on that. But those of you who are doing oil and gas, you cannot ignore this. The aspect of wind turbine technology, for example, in terms of advances in offshore wind turbine technology as enabling more efficient energy production, perhaps, in terms of carbon capture and utilization, what they call CCU, or carbon dioxide capture, CO2 capture. CCU technology is capture and actually repurpose carbon dioxide emissions, turning them into valuable products. In terms of carbon removal, for example, CCU is actually considered as a potential solution for reducing greenhouse and gas emissions. And then I know I super emphasize the aspect of digital supply chain management. Remember what they call the end-to-end visibility in terms of digital supply chain management that provides for real-time visibility into movements of goods and materials, enhancing efficiency. And then what they call inventory optimization, where companies use digital tools to optimize inventory levels and even reduce operational costs. Yeah. And then aspects to do with what they call innovation in well completion techniques, yeah, in terms of what they call frac technology, innovations in hydraulic fracturing technologies that aim to improve well productivity in terms of minimizing environmental impact, in terms of then you can argue it in terms of what they call smart completions, yeah, in terms of smart well completions, in terms of that employ what they call downhole sensors and even control systems for real-time well management. And again, you may also, I talked about innovation in terms of methane detection and reduction, methane sensing technology, for example, advanced sensors in terms of technology that are used to detect methane emissions more accurately and more rapidly, and in terms of methane mitigation strategies, in terms of innovations that include reducing methane emissions through equipment upgrades and even best practices. Yeah. You cannot forget environment and social impact, as I told you. Environment impact assessment becomes super important in terms of that are conducted to understand and mitigate potential environmental impacts in terms of oil and gas projects. And then obviously the social impact studies, these assess the effects of local communities in terms of cultural heritage and social well-being. Listen guys, I mean I could go on and on, but the idea is to help you understand that it's more than just what people are giving us these days. Yeah? It's serious business here. Energy trading and market analytics in terms of energy market platforms, for example. Online platforms facilitate what they call trading energy in terms of commodities and private market intelligence, for example. Aspects to do with price forecasting, for example. Market analysis in terms of data and even models to forecast energy prices and even trends. So when you're talking about the ongoing transformation in terms of oil and gas industry, it's a question of understanding the innovation, understanding sustainability, and understanding the efficiency, and so the understanding adaptability in terms of commitment to addressing these pressing global challenges that are key in ensuring significant energy sectors, as we just argued. Yeah, it's super important, my friends. We cannot forget waste reduction and recycling in the oil and gas. I know I talked about that loosely, but sustainable practices in terms of reducing waste generation, in terms of promoting recycling, it becomes an integral part in terms of minimizing the environmental impact of these operations. Yeah, the aspect of waste to energy. Some operations, as I said, should be able to convert waste materials into energy, contributing sustainable efforts. I don't know how much rubbish we have or waste we have that we could use into energy. How about artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of reservoir management? Yeah, reservoir modeling, for example, AI and machine learning in terms of applied to optimize reservoir modeling and even production forecasting and even well management as well. We have to use what they call predictive analytics. I know we wrote a book about that in the sport arena. So these technologies assist in terms of predicting equipment failures and also optimizing their production as well. Guys, you may also want to comprehend aspects through social and community investment programs in terms of community development initiatives. Yeah, well, oil and gas companies invest in social programs, infrastructure, educational support in terms of the local communities where they do operate. In terms of sustainability partnership as well, collaboration with local communities that aim to create sustainable and even positive impacts in terms of that mandate. So you need to comprehend that it's not just a simple thing, as I said. Minimizing flaring and venting is another aspect in terms of emission reduction. Efforts need to be made in terms of reducing what they call flaring and even venting of natural gas, which releases methane and even carbon dioxide. Yeah. Now, when you talk about flare gas recovery, then technologies have to be used to capture and utilize what they call flared gases, converting them into useful products as well. Then, of course, the super important is regulatory challenges and compliance. As I said, evolving regulations. The industry must adapt to evolving, environmental and safety regulations at local, at national, and even at international level. And in terms of compliance in addressing these challenges, compliance that require monitoring, that require reporting, that require meeting strict standards can be complex but super important. And then I know we talked about decentralization in terms of energy solutions for remote locations, especially in terms of microgrids. And I think we talked about this as in my address. One time I did an address to the President, His Excellency. If I was president for one day, I made those arguments. But decentralized energy solutions like microgrids provide reliable power in remote areas without access to traditional grid infrastructure. And then hybrid power systems, obviously, in terms of combining renewable energy sources with transitional or traditional fuels to ensure a stable supply. Yeah, I cannot underestimate security concerns, especially data security, cyber security, physical security, for example. In terms of the cyber threats, for example, the industry must address cyber security threats that could actually compromise operation and even critical infrastructure. So we need resilient strategies in terms of robust cyber security measures in order to protect and have recovery plans in terms of our oil exploration. And then embracing advanced oil and gas exploration technologies. Don't forget seismic imaging, 3D and 4D seismic technologies that improve the accuracy of subsurface mapping, and then drilling automation in terms of automated drilling systems that reduce costs and even increase drilling efficiency. And then you may want to also comprehend what they call sustainable well abandonment and site what they call remediation. Yeah, in terms of what they call an end of life operation. I talked about that decommissioning. But proper well abandonment and site remediation is crucial for minimizing what they call environmental impact. So you need to comprehend site restoration, which include land reclamation, for example, and even ecosystem restoration. And then you may want to comprehend things like carbon trading and offsetting, for example. Talk about carbon markets, for example, in terms of carbon trading that allows companies to buy and even sell emission allowances to meet regulatory requirements. You may also want to talk about things to do with offset projects, for example, companies that invest in projects that remove and reduce greenhouse emissions, thereby offsetting their own emissions. So, guys, friends, these topics underscore the ongoing transformation in the oil and gas industry as it embraces, as again, sustainability, technological advancement, social responsibility. So while addressing the need for more efficient and environmentally friendly energy practices, the industry's adaptability and innovation continue to shape the future. So this is what I was emphasizing, that the syllabus of oil and gas has to be looked at in that context. And please understand that there are certain challenges and certain drawbacks that may come with oil and gas exploration. Some of them have to do with environmental impact, for example, water contamination. Drilling these and hydraulic fracturing can actually lead to potential water contamination from chemical, additives and even naturally occurring substances. And then they could also have what they call habitat disruptions in terms of exploration, in terms of production activities that can disrupt these local ecosystems and wildlife habitats. And then aspects to do with health and safety risks as well. In terms of work safety, for example, in terms of oil and gas operations that can actually be, hazardous, with risks in terms of accidents and even injuries, particularly offshore and drilling exploration. And then obviously the health concerns, where workers may actually be exposed to toxic substances which can result in health problems. So the point I'm making, that those of you who are looking at oil and gas, you have to look at it with another eye, in terms of resource depletion, for example, reservoir depletion. Oil and gas fields age, so it becomes increasingly challenging and costly to extract the remaining reserves, Then what they call the oil peak. The world faces what they call inventory challenge in reaching the peak oil, In terms of the point at which global oil production, plateaus or it declines, And then aspects to do with energy intensity, the aspect of high energy consumption. Oil and gas extraction, particularly from unconventional sources, requires significant energy input, Greenhouse emissions as an aspect in terms of the energy intensity and of extraction contributes to carbon emissions, And then there's aspects to do with the geopolitical conflicts, where, for example, resource conflicts in terms of oil and gas reservoirs are actually often, located in regions with geopolitical tensions leading to instability and conflict. And then the aspect of price volatility, for example, geopolitical events that can lead to fluctuations in terms of oil and gas prices impacting global economies, And then aspects to do with spills and accidents, where we're talking about oil spills, accidents such as oil spills that can have devastating effects on the ecosystem and on local economies, And then what we call well blowouts. Blowouts are seen in incidents like the Deepwater Horizon, for example, that can result in massive environmental damage, And then the bigger question of regulatory compliance in terms of complex regulations. Complying with evolving environmental and even safety regulation can actually be costly and even challenging, And then permit delays in some elements in terms of obtaining permits for exploration and drilling can actually be lengthy and even uncertain in terms of the processes, And then, as I said, resource nationalization becomes a deeper question as well, because resource ownership is as a question of dispute. Conflict can actually arise over resource ownership and the distribution of revenue, particularly in countries with nationalized oil industries, In terms of creation what they call investment uncertainty. Resource nationalism can actually discourage foreign investment in its own way. And then technological and even infrastructure challenges, especially have to do with things to do with deep water drilling. Deep water exploration poses technological and even operational challenges due to extreme conditions. And then aspects to do with infrastructure maintenance. Maintaining aging pipelines and facilities can actually be costly and complex. And then socio-economic disparities, for example, In terms of local impact, the argument of oil and gas projects that can lead to disparities in terms of local economies, impacting communities, and in some cases the argument of the resource curse, In some cases the resource dependent economies suffer from resource curse with economic instability and corruption, and then the aspects of climate change concerns, In terms of carbon emissions. The oil and gas industry is a significant contributor in terms of greenhouse emissions, contributing to climate change, And these are questions that we need to understand. Perhaps that's why we need to address the aspect of transition challenges in terms of the industry facing challenges in transitioning to a more sustainable practice. So my emphasis is, those of you who are looking at oil and gas, widen your perspective. Think outside the box and throw the box away. In terms of market fluctuations, for example, price volatility, oil and gas prices are actually subject to rapid and unpredictable fluctuations, impacting the financial stability of companies and nations. If you argue that in terms of market competition, for example, market dynamics and even competition can affect profitability. Yeah. So by addressing these challenges and drawbacks, often involves serious development in terms of the implementation of advanced technologies, in terms of rigorous safety measures, in terms of environmental safeguards and sustainable practices, and therefore the industry, as the industry continues to evolve, we need to mitigate these issues and therefore have a more feasible global energy landscape. Yeah. So I don't know whether it's prudent for us to simply restrict ourselves in terms of oil and gas per se, but perhaps look at it in terms of a transitioning. Okay. Other challenges would be like social and community impact, community disruption, for example. Oil and gas projects definitely disrupt local communities, leading to issues like increased traffic, noise, pollution, influx, and stuff like that. Then there are issues to do with land use conflicts that may arise when oil and gas activities actually, compete with other land, users like agriculture and tourism. And then resource access and availability is another aspect in terms of resource availability. So accessing and even extracting oil and gas in remote and potentially unsustainable, unstable regions can actually be logistically challenging. And then the aspect of resource dependency, over-reliance on oil and gas can make economies vulnerable to price fluctuations. Yeah. So, and then the aspect of well integrity, which is another thing that we need to talk about in terms of well corrosion. Yeah. Over time, well castings or well casings can actually corrode. Yeah. And leading to leakages and even environmental damage. Well casing failures can actually result in the well integrity issue, as I'm talking about. Yeah. And then technological innovation costs that have substantive effect in terms of research and development costs, in terms of developing and implementing cutting edge technologies for safer and more sufficient operation in terms of production that can be super expensive. And then the argument of rapid technological change, the fast pace of which technological advancement may require continuous adaptation and investment. Perhaps that's where our country needs to put a lot of effort. Yeah. And more importantly, in terms of energy transition pressures, what they call a shift to renewable energy, in terms of a transition away from fossil fuel, which poses challenges in terms of oil and gas companies to remain relevant in a changing energy landscape. Yeah. How about aspects to do with investor scrutiny? Investors and stakeholders increasingly demand what they call sustainability and clean energy commitments. Yeah. So my point is think outside the box, throw the box away. Compliance with emission reduction targets, for example. Emission reduction costs in terms of meeting emission reduction targets can be expensive and technically challenging as well. And then the aspect of carbon pricing, the introduction of carbon pricing mechanism can actually affect profitability. Yeah. And then the argument of geological uncertainty in terms of reservoir, what they call reservoir heterogeneity. Okay. What they call reservoir heterogeneity in terms of geological transformations can be complex, making it challenging to predict the distribution of these hydrocarbons accurately. So in terms of reservoir pressure and temperature, variations in terms of pressure and temperature conditions can actually impact the drilling and the production itself. And then you may also comprehend aspects to do with the resource recovery efficiency in terms of recovery factors. So not all hydrocarbons in a reservoir can actually be economically extracted, and improving recovery factors is a constant challenge as well. Yeah. And then you may want to look at it in terms of economic viability, striking the right balance between extraction costs and even reserve recovery is actually essential. So it's super serious business. So rather than being excited, it's a question of deep research. Yeah, energy infrastructure vulnerability, for example, cybersecurity threat. I just mentioned those. I remember susceptible to cyber attacks that can actually disrupt our entire process. Physical infrastructure vulnerability. You know, all those aspects in terms of vulnerability in terms of natural disasters, in terms of accidents. I mean, I could argue market competition in terms of global competition. Yeah. In terms of the oil and gas industry, which faces competition from other energy sources and emerging technologies, for example, yeah, and then the aspect of what they call market share challenges in terms of maintaining market share that can be challenging in terms of what they call rapid changing energy landscapes. So, guys, it's a big story that you just cannot take for granted. So even as we begin arguing the law of oil and gas in our country, it's important that we have a deep analysis of the entire story. For starters, I'll super emphasize that you may not be able to comprehend the depth, but we have been able to put down on paper and set some guidelines and some substantive research in terms of the books that we've written. When you go to our website at lubogo.org or suigenerislawup.com, you can be able to comprehend and find some of these things, and you acclimatize yourself with the research that we've been carrying out for you. I'll give some examples of some backfires in terms of examples of some of the most significant oil spills and fires that have severely, had colossal effects, and somehow how they were addressed. You may not remember, but those of you who may remember, this is what they call the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that occurred in 2010. Basically, an explosion of the Deepwater Horizon offshore drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico resulted from a blowout while drilling an exploratory well. And the effect is that one of the largest environmental disasters in history. It released an estimation of about 4.9 barrels of crude oil in the Gulf. This led to devastating marine life and even coastal communities. In terms of response, efforts included things like capping the well, extensive cleanup operations, and legal actions against BP, Transocean, and even Halliburton. So new regulations and safety guidelines were introduced to prevent future accidents. But those are learning points, yeah? There was another that had to do with what they call the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which happened in 1989. The Exxon Valdez oil tanker ran, aground on Bly Reef in Alaska, Prince William Sound, releasing over 11 million gallons of crude oil. It had severe damage on wildlife, marine, even ecosystems, and even local economies, with a long-lasting environmental impact. In terms of response, Exxon spent billions to clean up the efforts, and the incident led to what they call the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which improves spill responses and prevention measures. Yeah. Another that comes to mind is what they call Ixtoc 1 oil spill, which happened in 1979. The well blowout in the Bay of Campeche, Mexico, led to the release of approximately 3.3 million barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. It had a lot of effect in terms of environmental damage to coastal areas in Mexico and Texas, along with loss of marine life. So efforts to cap the well included drilling, well wells, and lessons learned contributed to improve drilling practices. We also had the Kuwait oil fires, which happened in 1991. During the Gulf War, retreating Iraq forces set fire to over 600 oil wells in Kuwait. It had intense fires in terms of smoke, in terms of soot that caused environmental damage and health issues, including respiratory problems. International firefighting teams tried to extinguish some of the fires, but took several months in terms of environmental remediation efforts that followed. You may also comprehend what they call the Piper Alpha oil platform explosion and fire that happened in 1988. It was a gas leak on the Piper Alpha platform in North Sea that ignited, resulting into a catastrophic explosion and fire. In terms of the explosion claimed about 167 lives, and the platform was actually destroyed. So there was significant response in terms of improved safety regulations that came out of that, in terms of practices that have to do with offshore oil and gas industry, including safety, critical equipment, and emergency response systems. there is another that they call the Maghril oil spill that in 2001, where an oil spill in the Maghril region of Armenia resulted from damaged pipelines contaminating the Magir River. The effects in terms of drinking water resources were actually polluted, and aquatic ecosystems were actually damaged. There was significant cleanups, replacement of damaged pipelines as a measure to prevent future spills have also been undertaken in that aspect. Then there's a popular one in Nigeria that has happened significantly in terms of an African perspective. As Africans, perhaps this is where we need to benchmark, but also to draw lessons from not only how to control spillages or fires, but also aspects to do with what they call the oil curse or the resource curse for that purpose, and also the Dutch disease. Those of you who have the liberty of the impression of going through our book, you comprehend some of these aspects because we make a lot of reference to them and try to give substantive advice on how these can actually be avoided and how some of these challenges can actually be mitigated. So we know and that we are aware that we are with this blackboard, as they call it, but even as we engage in it, we have to be mindful of what it is now, what is it going to be tomorrow, but even before what it is tomorrow, how we're going to manage it, so that we can prevent challenges that other people have gone through, like the Montara oil spill, that was an uncontrollable blowout that occurred at the Montara oil, and the gas wellhead platform in terms of the coast of Australia. The spill released an estimated about 4,500 barrels of crude oil and natural gas that into the Timor Sea, affecting marine life and even coastal areas. I know that for every challenge or for every issue, there were lessons to learn. Perhaps that's the better one. But we may not have to wait for our own lessons. We have to learn to benchmark. You may also want to look at what they call the Bansfield Oil Depot fire in 2005, an explosion and fire at the Bankfield Oil Storage Depot in UK that resulted from a massive fuel leak. The incident was the largest peacetime explosion in Europe, and damaging surrounding structures and causing significant environmental impact. Obviously, we will argue that there are all lessons again in terms of regulations of how to deal with fuel storage facilities, but also you may want to learn from the Dilian oil spill in 2010, where two pipelines in the port of Dilian, China, exploded and released over 1,500 tons of crude oil into the Yellow Sea. The result was that it contaminated beaches and fishery resources and marine ecosystems, impacting local communities. And in terms of response, there was a massive cleanup, obviously, but also regulatory challenges and adaptations were taken into consideration. As far as measures in China's oil industry, you may also want to learn from the lack magnetic train derailment in 2013, where a train carrying crude oil derailed and actually exploded in Lac Magnetic, Quebec, Canada. The explosion and fire killed about 47 people and destroyed the town center. So the incident led to increased scrutiny in terms of rail transportation of hazardous materials, in terms of improved regulations and safety practices. You may also want to learn for purposes of our country in terms of what they call the Chapao oil refinery fire in 2005, where there was a massive fire in Chapao in the oil refinery in Pakistan that resulted from the fuel tank explosion. The fire caused significant damage to the refinery, pollution in terms of the nearby area, and also several fatalities. You could argue that there were some lessons that were learned in terms of safety measures and also emergency response protocols in terms of the Pakistan oil industry. Perhaps Uganda can benchmark from some of these areas. So as I said, when you're dealing and you're talking about oil, you are dealing with something that is big, that has to be extremely comprehensive, that has to be well articulated in terms of formidable preparations, in terms of formidable research, in terms of improved emergency preparedness. So it's not just a question of engaging into this thing without doing substantive research, and that's why we are laboring to speak about it, to talk about it, but also to create sustainable redresses and avenues that can be able to guide our country and our nation to thrive. You may want to borrow from Santa Barbara oil spills in 1969 as well. The oil spill occurred in Santa Barbara channel off the coast of California due to a blowout of the Union Oil Company Platform A. It had spillage effects to a tune of about 3 million gallons of crude oil, resulting in extensive damage to the coastline and the marine life. As I said, that particular one led to the creation of what they call the Environmental Protection Agency and the passage of environmental protection laws, particularly in that part of the world, the US. You may want to remember what they call the Castillo de Belva, okay, which is the tanker fire of 1983. The Spanish oil tanker Castillo de Belva caught fire off the coast of South Africa after explosion in one of its cargo tanks. The fire led obviously to a release of oil into the ocean and threatened a lot of marine life. So in terms of response, there was salvage operations and even firefighting efforts that managed to extinguish the fire, but the incident highlighted the risk associated again with transporting oil, as I said. You may also want to borrow this from the Torrey Canyon oil spill that happened in 1967, where the oil tanker Torrey Canyon ran aground on rock off the coast of Cornwall, England, releasing approximately 119 tons of crude oil. It had widespread environmental damage in terms of affecting the marine ecosystem, in terms of the shorelines in the United Kingdom and France. In terms of response, efforts included things like aerial, dispersant spraying and salvage operations. But the incident, of course, spurred discussions on international regulations for oil tankers. Then you may also want to argue or look at the Bass Enterprise Production Company blowout that happened in 1980. The blowout on an oil well in Mississippi in the USA, which resulted in the release of oil and gas over a period of 9 months. Think about that. And the effect had prolonged blowout, contaminated land and water resources, affecting local communities. In terms of response, there has been intensive effort over there to cap the well and also prevent further environmental damage, along with increased safety measures in the industry. So I hope I hope these instances will be able to be reminders for you and myself and our country in general, in terms of engaging and appreciating the dangers of that are associated with oil and gas exploration and production and transportation. So it's important that these responses lead to advanced safety standards, emergency response protocols, and even environmental protection measures in terms of that. Now, if you are to, for purposes of Africa, the one that comes, as I told you, Nigeria, the one of the Niger Delta region, had experienced numerous oil-related environmental incidents due to oil exploration, production, and even transportation. The Niger Delta oil spill is not a single event, but persistent and even long-term due to its various spills over the years. These spills have actually led significant environmental, social, and even economic consequences, making it one of the most severe oil spills related to backfires in Africa. Yeah. The Niger Delta region, obviously in Nigeria, is a home to extensive oil and gas operations with numerous pipelines, wells, and even production facilities. And the oil spills in this Niger Delta have actually been caused by a combination of factors, including pipeline vandalism, equipment failure, and even inadequate maintenance. And as a result, this has actually led to what they call environmental impact. And these spills have actually devastated local ecosystems, contaminating waterways, farmlands, and even mangrove forests. So marine life and even biodiversity have actually been severely affected. In terms of health and livelihood, local communities that rely on fishing and agriculture have actually seen their livelihood disrupted, and residents often face health issues in terms of exposure or due to polluted water and even air. In terms of social disruption, the spills have actually led to social tensions and even conflict within the region. So as communities demand compensation and even environmental remediation, it has also had economic consequences where the oil spills have actually economic implications in terms of impacting Nigeria's oil revenue and the ability to attract even foreign investment. We could argue that certain responses have been addressed in terms of the spills that include cleanups by these oil companies or government agencies and even international organizations, but there have been there have also been legal actions and calls for better regulation in terms of corporate responsibility in the oil and gas industry. So unfortunately, despite these efforts, the Niger Delta remains a region that is grappling heavily with persistent environmental and even social challenges caused by the oil spills. So it's important to understand that the complexity of the issue, really in terms of the difficult terrain and the history of tensions between the local communities and the oil industry, it has become a serious issue there. And that's why perhaps they were arguing in terms of what they call the oil curse or the resource curse for that purpose, where something that was designed to be good or perhaps was intended for the good has turned out to be a curse and what a nightmare of sorts. And that's what something Uganda should learn, and also look at the Dutch disease on the other hand, the over-reliance, the possibility of over-reliance of revenues that are arising out of oil singly can lead to the neglect of other substantive or fundamental sources of income that would bolster our economy, for example, agriculture and the likes. So those are questions that we need to look at and address, even as we get excited about this guy called Black Gold. Not so. My name once again is Isaac Christopher Lubogo. Please find our books, especially all the books, at lubogo.org and suigeneris.com, but you can even find them at Amazon, Scribd, Digital to Draft, Smashwords, Lambert, and all major leading universities in terms of the repositories in this country and the entire world. And so be blessed and get blessed. I have to take leave. Thank you for your attention. God bless.